Hello, I'm Li Hao. It's Svelte question time. You have any questions about Svelte? I have answers for them. And the question for today is: can I use Svelte component inside a React app? Can I use a Svelte component inside a React app? I don't know what you're thinking about. Why would you want to use Svelte component inside a React application? But nonetheless, I'm going to show you how you can do it. Right, so in this video, we're going to talk about how to use Svelte component inside a React app. So we're going to take a look at how we can do that. In the meantime, I'm going to create a React app using create React app. The boilerplate, the generator, it will generate a React app for us because it's taking very long, so I'm gonna fast forward everything. And so we have created our React app, and now we're gonna prepare for our Svelte application, right? Svelte components, sorry. So over here, I have my Svelte component written over here that has that I've come up with some interesting API features for our Svelte component so that we can see the integration between a React application with our Svelte component. In this case, we have create event dispatcher so that we can dispatch events, component events. We have props A and B, right? And we have context. We have component methods, right? So we have various points where we can play around and think about how we can use our components. So we are in a React application. This is created using create React app. So this, I've cleaned everything up, but importing a component. So this component is not an actual Svelte component, but it should feel like a Svelte component under the hood, but it's a React component, right? So this component is gonna be our wrapper. For at this moment it's returning now, but it will be like our wrapper. It will be the bridge between Svelte world and React world. Right, so we're gonna focus most of our time over here. So as you can see in this video, it's as much as a React tutorial than a Svelte tutorial, but nonetheless it's still about Svelte, right? And Svelte loves React, React loves Svelte. Everyone is happy, right? I don't know. So anyway, this is what I'm gonna focus on today, which is to figure out how we can wrap the whole Svelte component inside a React component and use it like a normal use it as seamlessly within a React application. So the setup that I've done earlier on is to make this works is that it's about how we can import Svelte component. So there's two ways that you can import component written in Svelte. One way is that you compile your Svelte component ahead of time. So you compile a Svelte component into a JavaScript file, and then you import that JavaScript file directly inside our React application. That is one way. Number two would be import the Svelte module, Svelte file directly inside a component, but that also mean that you would have to configure the build tools, the build configurations over here to allow it to import the Svelte, to import a Svelte module. So what I did over is that because there's no way that I can change webpack configurations of a React app, a create React app. So what I did is I do the eject. I eject everything, and now I'm coming over here to webpack config and add these few lines over here. Right, test Svelte and using Svelte loader. So this to allow us to import Svelte module directly, we need a Svelte loader. So I go to the Svelte loader site and take a look at the instructions over there, and I just copy these few lines over. And also I installed both Svelte and Svelte loader as my dependencies. So these are all settled. So now I can't directly import this Svelte component. So the default export, remember, is a Svelte component class. So most likely we can just use it. Right. So for now, component is returning now. So if you take a look at our browser over here, it's empty. So this is a clean, empty page right now, and we're gonna figure out how to fill that in. Right. So the first thing is we need to figure out where should we mount, or how or when do we mount our Svelte components to a React component. to be part of the React application. So the way usually how this works is, if it's not limited to Svelte. If you look at any JavaScript library out there that has like a React wrapper, usually what they do is they will create an empty div container and then render everything inside, right? Have your render an empty div and then mount whatever like vanilla code or your Vue.js code or your Svelte code inside this container. So we're going to create this div, and to mount it in, we need the reference of this element, right? So in React, to reference an element, you need ref. So I'm going to say div ref. Use ref. And I'm going to say ref equals to div ref. So now with the reference of the div, I need to mount our Svelte component in this div, right? So you can only do that in the use effect. So this is the time where this div has already created and mounted by by React, and then now is the time where you get the reference to this div and do something with it. So over here, use effect, we're gonna say because we're gonna use a div ref, we're gonna add that as a dependency. Div ref.current equals to new the current is where we're going to mount, right? So we're going to create a new component equals a new Svelte component. So the target will be where we're going to mounting our div, which is the div. Okay, and of course we need to remember in a use effect we can return a function to do cleanup. So whenever this component is being unmounted, we also want to unmount our Svelte component. So here we're going to say component dot destroy. Okay, so this is to remember to do our cleanup. We're going to save this and come over here and take a look. It's taking a while, but yeah, we see our Svelte component showing on the screen. Yay! So if you try to click any button over here, everything works because everything inside here, all the buttons you see is within the Svelte component. Svelte handles all the reactivity inside here, so you don't have to worry about that, right? So that's how easy it is, I guess. Although you have to create a ref and create a use effect. So in this video, I'm mostly using a functional component over here. So I'm going to use hooks to do that. So hopefully, if you're familiar with, I think this is the way to go in at the current moment, 2021. Most people are excited with hooks, so that's why I'm going to go with hooks. So now the next thing I'm going to go for is that you see all these props over here. We need to figure a way to pass a custom props to pass some props in from the React world to Svelte. Right? If you refresh, you see that the default value is 3 and 4 because we didn't pass any props. But what we want to do is we're gonna come over here and say pass in A equals to 5 and B equals to 12. We're gonna pass a custom value in, but right now it's not. Okay, so what we can do is we can come over components over here. So A and B is actually being passed as the props of this React component, this wrapper, right? So we can get A and B over here and can pass this to A and B to our Svelte component, right? So I can come over here and say props equals to A and B, save it. And now immediately you can see when I refresh this page, you see 5 and 12, right? That's great. Okay, so everything sounds good. Although you know that in React, usually when you pass this, you're expecting like a controlled component and you can't change the value of A anymore. But in Svelte, it's kind of a little bit different because there's it's not controlled, right? So that's the thing about in Svelte and React. So depending on whether you think that this is a bug or this is something you want to fix, then probably you would have to figure a way to listen every time when A and B changes. We want to set the default value A and B value back to the Svelte component and says that, hey, you shouldn't change your value, So that's something we are not going to do, because we are going to just do like a callback style and update fully controlled rather than just like one-way controlling and fix the value, right? I think some of the case, sometimes React actually will warn you when you specify a value to an input and does not provide a callback function. So that is usually not an intended case where you have an input that is like semi-control, where you set a value but there's no way to change it. Right, so when you want to have a reactive value within React, right? I always say React. Then what you need is a state. Right, so here I'm going to create two states for A. This is use state. Initial value is 5, and B. I'm going to set B. Initial value is 12. So I'm going to pass in A and B to the components, and as well as on A change, I'm gonna pass in set A, and on B change, I'm gonna pass in set B. So here is where we want to set a value, as also we have a way to call it back to update our states, right? So that over here, I'm gonna display. I'm gonna add a horizontal line. Here I have A equals to A and B equals to B. So now what I want to see is that, oops, I need to import use state. What I want to see is that whenever I change this, the state value from React should update together as well, right? I want to see that this and this get updated in the React world. So we want to have changes happening in the Svelte to updates React. So usually what you're gonna do in Svelte, when you have a component that has a props and you want to know that whenever you change, you want to update your own states, own variables, what you usually do is you would write something like this, right? Component and then bind A equals to variable, and you probably want to write something like this, but binding, two-way binding is not available in React, although it's available in Svelte, but it's not available in React. Usually in React, you pass in a value, is the data flow one way, and then you want to get updated, you need a callback to update the value on the outside, right? So there's only one way to change this variable, which is from the parent to the child, and then for the child to update the parent, you have to use a function callback. So what we're gonna do is, probably for now, we're gonna figure way to we need a function we need to add a few more props, like for example, on A change, export let's on B change, and we're going to call this function in Svelte whenever A and B change. So we can pass this function from the React to Svelte so that Svelte can notify and update React. So here I'm going to say let's see, on A, type of is, if it's a function, then we're gonna call on A change. And so this reactive statement will always be called whenever on A change, on it, wherever this variable or A change, right? So in both cases, we will have to notify. We'll call this function. Right, so in most of our cases, what we'll assume is that A or B will change and we'll notify and call this function, right? So, okay, let's save this and come over here to the component, and we're gonna pass this in as well. So on A change and on B change. Okay, I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna pass this to in as well as props. Save and refresh. Okay, so now I have now we pass in the function, the function in the React to set the states, A and B states, into the all the way to this component and all the way to our Svelte component. So now when we change our value over here like this, you see that the value is updating on the React side as well, right? Needless to say, this is from React, and just let's say here. Right, I'm in React and I'm in Svelte, right? So that you know that this value from Svelte updates and you see these changes on React, right? So sometimes you say that, oh wow, does it mean that every time I have more variables, more state props, I want to update it from the Svelte to React, I have to create new props, additional burden, sort of burden on the Svelte side, because Svelte does not have to need this function, right? So I would propose like maybe an alternative that you can consider. Maybe we can, instead of calling a function like a and b, maybe we can, what we do is we can dispatch an event, right? So this event, we can, like, no matter whether a or b changes, we just dispatch the same event called maybe called change. And then we just, maybe to differentiate, we have a type called a, that the value is a. So this statement will be called whenever the value a is changed, because dispatch can't be changed because it's a constant, and there's no other variable. So every time a changed, this whole reactive statement will be executed and dispatch a new event, a new component event, right? Same goes to b, where the type is called b, right? So let me just comment out this too. So now we always have this event called change, where we can listen on our parent side. So in the component here, we can listen to this event, component dot on change event. Okay, and then we have the type or value, right? Type or value from event.detail. So we check if the type is a, then probably we can call on a change with the value, right? Value. And else if the type is b, we can say on b change with the value, right? So now we're using an event on the Svelte side, so that maybe you think that this is less cumbersome on the Svelte component side, right? And you have like one handler to dispatch this, to listen to all the changes event coming from Svelte side, and dispatch it to different callback functions from React, right? So here we don't have to pass in this to anymore, and just to verify it still works, let's move this and everything. Let's just refresh again. Move and everything still works as intended, right? So here it's up to you whether you pass in a function into from React to Svelte to update like a parent state, or you dispatch events from Svelte so that your wrapper component just listen to all these different kind of events and call a different callback functions. I wouldn't say that there's no perfect world over here. Yeah, that's the differences between Svelte and React, and we kind of have to bear with it. But as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that maybe we can figure a way to simulate this, right? We say that in Svelte, when you have a parent, what you do is you love to write something like this. Sorry, not bind this. Bind a equals to a variable and update a, right? So definitely there's a function somewhere, there's a way. Although I know we talk about component API, client-side component API for Svelte, we didn't see any way that we can bind a props to a variable, right? But definitely there's some way that Svelte does it, but it's internal. So we maybe can figure a way that copy that and see how it goes, right? So let's to find that out. Let's go to Svelte REPL. I'm gonna copy all this component over here, just because. And here in the app, I'm gonna import component. And I'm gonna bind a variable, right? Bind A to A. So we're gonna figure out like how does this work in Svelte, right? Because in this file, there definitely has a function to update this A, right? We're just gonna find that out. So let's take a look over here. I see bind. Probably there's a bind somewhere. Okay, binding callbacks, bind. I'm not sure about the callback part, but this sounds like what we want, right? We want to bind a component A and component A binding. So I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm not sure about what this A is and what this component A binding is. Let's just look for this. Okay, this is a function that takes in a value and you call a function. So I'm assuming based on this, I'm just guessing that this value is the internal, is the props, the A value, the value of the props A in for this component, right? I'm guessing that, but so maybe you can just try copy this out and try it out, right? But what is this A? Is this A the props or is this A the variable? So let's try rename this. Maybe I'm calling it B. Okay, this is still A. So A is the props, right? So we're gonna come over here, copy this part, and into our component. Okay, we'll just do this component. This is our component, and this is a function. So if it's A, then probably we have the value, and we are going to call on A change the value. Right, this is probably what I'm gonna call. Let's comment all this out first. So let's find where we can import bind. Well, bind is here importing from Svelte internal. So this is definitely an internal API. So word of disclaimer, this is definitely something may break, no guarantee. It may or may not break, no guarantee at all. But let's just copy this out. So this is quite common, if you don't know, for people to use some internal API. When I say common, it does not mean that I'm endorsing it, saying that, hey, you should do it. But it's common in a sense where people usually, there are people who try to reverse engineer. In our case, we do like, it's kind of reverse engineer. Like we look at the output and figure out like, okay, this is bind and maybe we should copy this out and try it and see, right? So we are reverse engineering this. Right, and there's a lot of libraries out there that people are trying to if there's no public API, people will try to reverse engineer, get some private APIs and use it in your library. But the most important thing is usually you would have to also make sure that you're using the right version of Svelte. So you can specify in package.json like what kind of version of Svelte you are supporting. If you are writing a library that's like this, that like a wrapper library that wraps a Svelte component for React and do it just as for particular specific, either for specific components or any generic component, you need to make sure that the Svelte version you're using that to compile the component is within a version that you're supporting that's using this binding, right? If one day Svelte release a breaking changes to this bind, and I wouldn't say it may, it won't tell anyone, right? It will just break because this is internal API. There's no need to notify anyone. But if it breaks, then your user will complain. So usually you will have to pin like a certain range of Svelte version from certain version to another version. And if it updates, you will have to release another version of library that supports like a certain version of Svelte and onwards that use a different bind, things like that. So I wouldn't say it's uncommon. There are libraries that certainly use some secret APIs that's out there. As long as you can import it, it's no longer that secret, right? But of course, it's always used at your own risk. The maintainers know it, and the maintainers of like these kind of libraries are the one that's handling all this complexity without you knowing it, right? All you just use like your component as like you never think about it, but sometimes they do use some private APIs that may break. That's why sometimes you see libraries says that, oh, this supports a certain version of this library until this library, and there's a breaking change in this library that breaks your the library that you're writing, and you will have to upgrade it if you want to upgrade your library. Say for example, you have to upgrade Svelte to upgrade if you are upgrading Svelte, you also have to upgrade this library, and this library will have to catch up and make sure it's up to date with the latest version of Svelte and what version of Svelte is supported for what version of this library and things like that. Right, sorry for all the long-winded, but I guess you probably have seen this kind of scenarios before, so it's not uncommon, but I'm not endorsing that this is the way to go. It's like use at your own risk. You know what you're doing, and yeah, just do it at your own risk. So we have this binding, and yeah, it's so much, but we haven't seen whether it works or not. So we're binding A with this, and probably let's just do bind B with on B change as well. Let's come back and refresh. Okay, so moment of truth. If you take a look, we commented out all the dispatch changes, so there's no change event anymore. So everything is relying on the binding, right? We commented everything out. So let's see. Okay, it works, right? When we change this value, this changes as well. When we change this changes as well. So this binding works, but it's an internal API, so use at your own risk. So now this reminds me of like, how about based on some convention, maybe we have a way to know that what are the props. Maybe you have a way to specify a list of props that we can bind to, and then loop through and bind all of them, right? So maybe let's do it this way. So I'm looking at this component, the props that we're passing in. We kind of know that all props, a callback function are all starts with an on, right? On something change, and value we're passing in is A and B. So how about let's come over here and say, make this as like just props. Okay. So we're gonna pass all the props in like this. And here, I'm gonna loop through all the props. So I'm gonna say object.keys props. I'm gonna say for key in of object keys. If the key starts with on, if it's not starting with on, then we just assume, okay, this is real on convention, right? But just demonstrate a way that you maybe can automatically bind all the props, right? So maybe assumes that if the key does not start with on, and we have maybe we have this key called on, key to uppercase change. So this is being lazy, but you know, like key, because A uppercase will be capital A, right? We have a capital A, but what we should do is make it like a camel case thing. Right, but I mean, we have one letter prop, so we're gonna say this is on A change, on B change. If we have this key as well, this in props, then what we're gonna do is that we're gonna bind it. I'm gonna bind this with that value, right? So bind this key with this props. Copy all this in. Right, props this function, call it as a so now we kind of like automatically bind out all the props. So refresh, save again and refresh. Everything still works, okay. And if you take a look here, we have another props called sum. We can do that as well. We can create this called sum, set sum. Let's make initial value just now. So we're gonna have sum equals to sum. Oh, here we need to all caps, right? So we're gonna on sum change. Yeah, that's the cost of being lazy. Set sum. Okay, and here in React, we also need to just show like the value of sum is updated, right? So once we've done that, let's refresh. we see the sum is 17, which is correct. As we change, this sum also become 24. So we automatically bind, two-way bind all the variables, all the props on the component that is passed as a props as a component, and as long as there's a on, the props name change, right? And then so we'll bind it, right? So yeah, so we can do it over here like this. Then we can save, kind of automate a bit, right? Okay, so now we able to update props. And you've seen how I can listen to component events, right? Although this was initially I was trying to say dispatch sum, you can listen to some events, but we've seen how we can listen to change events, so that's pretty much the same. So next thing we're gonna do is we are going to get this context. Right? So context over here you see is called undefined, but in Svelte component, and we're gonna create a context in React. And the context I've created is called, like, is this context. So we're going to create a context provider outside over here. I'm going to pass a value called this comes from React. And I want to be able to get this value in Svelte. So now, my refresh, you still can't see it yet in Svelte. So we want to pass this value from React into Svelte. So how React context works is that the value, there's no other way to read the value of a context except of being inside a React component. So there's no way that I can figure a way to get a reference of that context and read it out from here. So probably what I can do is I'm going to read it from this component, this wrapper component, and pass it down using a Svelte context. So here I'm going to say context value equals to use context. I'm going to pass in this context, right? So I'm just assume this will be the string context in Svelte. So I get this value and I'm going to come over here and say context equals a new map. And I have context and the value is this value from this use context. So this is going to read out the value from the context and going to pass it in, set it as a context for our Svelte component. So I'm going to save this. Let's refresh. You see, this comes from React. Yay! We have React context in Svelte component. How exciting is that? So now let's try to change something, right? So in React, context is reactive. When you change the value of a context, it actually all the context consumer will update itself. So for example, if I have my context as a state, what I expect is that this value is going to be reactive in React component, right? So here I'm going to pass in the context and I am going to show you the value of context. At the same time, I'm going to have an input that updates this value, right? So in React, how you do it is you have to get pass the context to the value of the input, as well as have an unchanged listener that updates the value of context. You're gonna get event.current target.value. Right, so here I am listen to changes from the input and set the context, update the state, right? So if I come over here, you see that this context comes from React, and if I change this, technically, if you have a React component, this value will change. But this is a Svelte component, so in Svelte, context is not reactive at all. So what should we do? If you watched my video previously about reactive context, we say that to achieve a reactive value in a context, what we can do is we're going to pass a store down in the context, pass a store down through context, and we update the store value that instead will achieve a reactive context. So we are going to do that. We are going to assume this is a store, so we're going to use $ prefix to read the value out of it. And in the components, we're going to pass writable store over here. Okay, so this is, we're gonna import from Svelte store writable. So here, let's refresh. Okay, we get a star, but it's still not reactive yet because we haven't updated, we haven't set a value of the star. So first is we need to get a reference of this star and update it. So how do we do that? Well, again, probably we're gonna use a ref over here in React. So we're gonna have a reference to a star so that we can get a reference to a star outside of this use effect that create this, so that later on we can reference to this star and update it later on. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a use effect to create this star or to update this star. So this gonna takes in a context value as well as a star reference. So if the star reference current is undefined, if we haven't created anything yet, then we're gonna create our star. I'm gonna come over here, copy this, right? We'll create a star. But if this star is created, right, what we're gonna do is gonna call set and call a new value, context value. Right, so this use effect has to be called before our use effect that we mount a component in, so that because in React effect calls in order, so this will be called first. We create so they make sure that the star is being created, and then over here we're gonna just reference it, right? Just reference the current. So we got a reference of this, and let's see how it goes. Right, so this comes from React. And as we change, you see that we have a reactive context. The context in Svelte changes, the value changes as we are changing the value in Svelte, React. Yay! Okay, so we have our reactive context, using star. Let's see what else we can do. We need to do. So here we see that we have our star done. We updated our props. We able to listen to changes. I think one more thing would be over here is that we can call this function, call the reset function from React. So what I want to do is probably, I have this component. I want to get a reference of this component. Right? In React, you always have to get a reference. And later on, I want to have a button, reset. When I click, what I want to do is I want to call the resets method. So I'm going to assume, component current. I'm going to say that this reference, this component reference have a method called reset, and I want to call it. Alright, so this of course I would have to create it. Create use ref. Right, so thing is now how do I call this, and this function should eventually call this reset function in Svelte. Alright, so how should I do that? Right, so now you have a way to call it. You call it in a React world, and you have a function component method in the Svelte world. Now how do you bridge them? How do you do that over here in the middle? So first thing is we need to get a reference of the component that we're creating. Right here, this component is hidden within a use effect. There's no way to get this reference from the outside, because we want it from the outside, so that there's some way that we can call like component dot resets from the outside. Right, we want to do that. So again, we will need to use a reference. So we're gonna say component ref equals to use ref. So here I'm gonna call component ref the current equals to component. Now I have reference to this. Now the thing is how I'm gonna provide a method for this functional component so that outside can call, and that method that we implement over here. So we're gonna implement a function called reset, right? That will do this basically, component ref dot current dot reset. But we need to provide a way that from React able to call this function reset and eventually call this. Right? So what we can do is first is whenever you pass a reference in React to a component, And if it's a function component, actually it does not have reference at all. Function component cannot get a reference. So the way to get a reference in function component in React is you need to use something called a forward ref. You need to forward the reference being passed in to here. So here is the forwarded ref. So this ref is the one that is being passed in from outside, right? So this will not exist if you don't have the React forward ref. So now we have this ref. We want to attach method on it, so that from the outside we can get this reference and call like a resets. We're gonna add this method called resets onto that reference. So to do that in React, you use something called a use imperative handle. Pass in a ref, and then you have a function called init that you initialize. So this function needs to return an object where you have a reset method, so a reset function or method, right? So whatever this object is returned from here is going to be attached to the reference over here, right? So there you go. We're going to shift all this and put it in, and that's it. So let's refresh and take a look. So when we do reset, it will set all the values to 0. And let's take a look and click. Yeah, we reset everything to 0, and all these changes will reflect to React because we have a callback function, and that's amazing, right? So we're able to call a reset. We can call a component methods from outside from React world. Of course, you would think about you would think about, since we talk about ways like doing this binding, like what if we have a lot of function methods, component methods inside over here, and how do we call it like at one go, right? So maybe we have a list of functions, maybe a functions that maybe we have all the functions that prefix with method reset, right? Maybe something like this. And what we can do over here is that we can't get the component dot prototype, sorry, not this component but Svelte component. We can get all the methods defined in the Svelte component prototype and create this function over here, create this object, right? So meaning we can see we have mReset, we have random, right? So for example, we have two methods. Well, what we're going to do here is we're going to loop through the prototype to find out all these methods, and we're going to create functions for each of them. So for example, object, you'll call object dot get own property names. So this, if I come over here, you see that this will give us a list of methods, right? The constructor, mReset, and mRandom. So this is the list of methods that we can call inside the Svelte component. And also how this works is that actually, if you take a look over here, the compile code, you see that when you create a component methods like this, you find that there's like a new methods that is added to the component. So constructor, reset are all the things that are in the prototype, where you can get a list of them using get own property names. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to have I'm going to create an object, and I'm going to look through the names. And I'm going to create new function. So here object dot, so I'm going to create the name, but I don't want the m, right? M is just like a signal for me to let me know that anything with m is actually just like a component methods, right? So I would remove, I'm going to slice from first character and then to lowercase equals, okay, whoa, equals to a function. I'm going to take all the arguments. I'm going to call component ref.current and call this name, right? This is the function, and then call with all the arguments. So here I programmatically create the object with all the possible functions, right? So of course we don't need constructor. So if name equals to constructor, we need to just continue, skip it, right? And the rest we will add it here. So meaning this everything still works, right? Reset still works, but now it's possible for you to come over here and create a random button and just call random, and we don't have to implement that implement something anymore in the wrapper component, and hopefully this random will still works as it should, right? So we dynamically go through all the possible methods, all the methods in our Svelte component and add it to our component over here, right? So here use imperative handle, if I'm not wrong, there's a dependency list. Over here we just pass ref over here. So yeah, that's great. So we're able to call component methods from React to call methods in Svelte, right? So one last thing that I noticed that we didn't do is that we can have a button over here to increment like A or B, right? So I'm gonna say on click set A equals to A plus 5, say for example. We have a button like this. We can update the value from React, but we didn't update the value in Svelte, right? That's because we didn't really check any changes in the props over here like this, right? So I think what we can do is every time when there's changes in the props, I'm gonna call component.set. I'm not sure whether this will end up with a infinite loop, but let's try first. I think it works. Okay, we change it from here and we add it, and this gets updated as well, right? So yeah, previously I'm not sure whether this will cause the binding to backfire, because when you change, you set the props to the component, and then the component again realize that something has changed and then update it back. But I guess in this case, because all our props values are primitive, it's not an issue, right? Unless the props values are object, then there's no way. Svelte always treats object as mutation. There's always changes in objects, and then it will cause like the binding to call again and then update React. Yeah, but I think in React case, React will know that because object reference is still the same, there's no changes, so React will not re-render again and update the props of this component, and therefore calling the set again, right? So over here, I think we just do this and we just set all the props into Svelte component. So here you can set the component from value from outside, it's updating as Svelte. You can set from inside for Svelte component, it updates out back to the React component in the React world. So there you go, how to use a Svelte component inside a React application, right? We go through a lot of things. Basically we implement this enormous, gigantic React component that handles props changes. We handles event listeners from Svelte component events. We handle like context and talk about stores, as well as updating Svelte props, right? So that will be it. Usually if you find anything like a Svelte wrapper for like a wrapper component in React that allows you to write Svelte component inside a React application, usually that's what they are doing under the hood. But we managed to do all of this within roughly almost an hour, but I hope that you learned something today. Although we learned a lot of React stuff rather than Svelte stuff, but I guess this also makes you more understand on how Svelte's component API works, because we've interacted with a lot with like different component API, and we also learned about one secret private API that we are not supposed to use, or just use at your own risk, right? So if you have any questions, comments down below, and as always, share this video to the rest of the world so that they learn something. If you learn something and you wish them to learn something, share it to the world, right? As always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye.